All right, well, welcome back. We're speaking again with David Martin Jones, who is the author of History's Fools, a book we have discussed in a separate episode. Now, David, we're going to talk about an article that is going to be published in the journal Modern Age in January or February of next year, so 2021. We're talking in December of 2020. And this is a nice segue from your book, History's Fools, because it focuses, essentially for me, it's really an essay which is prompted by a book review. So you're reviewing Anne Applebaum's new book, The Twilight of Democracy, and you take the opportunity to write a short essay on what democracy means and whether democracy is really declining. And you sum up in 3 pages a fantastic range of scholarly arguments here, and it overlaps your book, History's Fools. So there's, in a short space of writing, there's a lot to talk about here. Maybe if you could just start by explaining on your first page, which is page 64 for the students, you're talking about the third wave of democratization and the many people from both ends of the political spectrum that agreed at that time in the 1990s that we were living in a third wave, which would be the final wave. It'd be the end of history. So this would be the final wave of democratization. Democracies had won. Now, can you just explain why you think there was this consensus, this left-right consensus in the 1990s about what we now know to be a false promise?
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting now, when we're in 2020, and the convolutions of democracies, particularly the key ones in the West, the United States and the United Kingdom, who've had representative democratic institutions in America since the late 18th century, and in Britain since the late 19th, representative democratic institutions. I mean, the idea that we are now in democratic turmoil is a response to the end of history moment again, where it seemed with the collapse of communism, there was no alternative to liberal democracy if you wanted the goods that modernity brings with it. So assuming that the modern condition of industrialization, accountable governance, universal kind of recognition of the individual or the citizen as a member of a polity and or value, and that an arrangement that is going to be reasonable and productive could only be democratic. The alternatives that had, contested the ideological space from the end of the 19th century in either a nationalist or fascist version or a communist or socialist version had demonstrably failed the test of history. Fascism in Italy and Germany in the 1940s and 50s, and even its continuation in Spain and elsewhere down to the 1970s had failed. And then the key revolutionary moment for the triumph of democracy was the failure of the communist order in the Soviet Union and its subsequent dissolution. And even China, the remaining sort of large communist regime, seemed to be moving away from its totalitarian thinking and internal market arrangement to an opening to capitalism and therefore democracy. So the assumption was that any regime that wanted to be modern, that wanted the economic growth and development the educational opportunities that went with capitalism required democracy. So the idea that you could manage an economy without democracy seemed to have been tested and failed by the 1990s. So that the arguments that were put forward in a number of journals that made their mark in the 1990s, like Democratization Journal and the Journal of Democracy, as well as key works like Samuel Huntington's The Third Wave or Robert Dahl's work on polyarchy, all assumed that, and the other key thinker, Seymour Martin Lipset, in a number of articles from the 60s onwards, had argued or shown or seemed to have shown that even if you started out as an authoritarian regime, and we'll come back to that term, nevertheless, you couldn't and even in an authoritarian conditions, as in, say, somewhere like South Korea, which was a military dictatorship under the Park family in South Korea, they were open to, or their growth was made possible by the openness of the American market for their goods, their products like Samsung or Hyundai. And once you created a middle class, as a growing economy would, you would have to, in the literature, liberalize, i.e. open up a political space, which was a precondition of a transition to democracy. So all this comparative political thinking and the quantifiable data that seemed to go with it showed, it seemed conclusively, that if you had economic development leading to growth that was distributed across the population, you would create a wealthy and increasingly educated middle class that would not be content with being told what to do, but would want the kind of liberal openness that was what Western, European, and American societies had already achieved. So it became not either a set of waves, as it was for Huntington, or almost a teleological progress, as it was for Fukuyama. And therefore, whether it was on a conservative like Huntington or a more liberal left thinker like Friedman, democracy was the only game in town.
Yeah. So Anne Applebaum begins her new book in the 1990s. So it's sort of, what do we call it? She begins with a sort of vignette from her own life. So she was in Poland with her Polish husband, who was in the Polish government, and she is hosting other intellectuals, transatlantic intellectuals. So she's an American, but has been largely active in Europe. She's hosting fellow transatlanticists whose work we know, Simon Heffer, John O'Sullivan, amongst them. And in this opening vignette, she makes the point that they were all of these people were in the consensus of the 1990s. They all accepted the triumph of liberal democracy. And yet now some of these people will cross the street to avoid each other. That's how she puts it. So I'm going to show the cover of Anne Applebaum's new book up here. So she goes on to blame conservatives for the decline of democracy. And she identifies this authoritarian personality or authoritarian predisposition in both the new leaders of the democracies since in the 2010s, but also in the electorate too. And you're going to find a problem with that characterization. So can you explain what's wrong with Applebaum's retrospective on the promise or the triumphalism of the 1990s for democracy and our current consensus, which is that democracy is in crisis?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that her opening vignette, as you say, because the book begins with a party and it kind of ends with a party as well. But the second party doesn't include any of the personnel who were at the first party. The significance of the party in Poland is that Poland has, been the product of a an almost velvet revolution that the communist regime or the puppet regime has disintegrated. There is now the promise of openness, of a return to a European political arrangement, and Poland had a historic constitution that was far more liberal and open in the 15th and 16th century than many, other Western European states at that time. So Poland seemed to have rediscovered its European roots and was also part of this third wave of democratization that had suddenly hit Eastern Europe after the bleak night of a Soviet despotism imposed after 1945. What's ironic about Applebaum is that she was part of a liberal conservative, if you like, understanding. In other words, she was a big supporter of both Reagan and Thatcher, as were those she came to denounce, like John O'Sullivan. And for some reason, but for some quite odd reason, well, I mean, it's an interesting reason to interrogate. She thinks that Thatcher and Reagan would be on the side somehow of a European Union arrangement that seems from a classically liberal perspective to be proto-despotic, as people like O'Sullivan and Heffer, who were at a party, seem to think. And she seems to think otherwise, that Europe is the great good that any properly liberal conservative or classical liberal would embrace. And I think, and then she wants to further, maintain that somehow these writers who were Thatcherite, classical liberal, with a conservative valuation of tradition, have somehow abandoned that for what she calls a kind of constructive nostalgia that holds on to some dead past and now wants to bring it back and manipulate popular discontent with the effects of globalization to go back to what was called in the 1950s in a famous article, a paranoid style of politics. And this she sees, so she wants to see herself as maintaining a kind of classical liberal conservative position, which she says that Reagan and Thatcher would presumably embrace, I don't know, Black Lives Matter, and certainly Joe Biden, rather than Trump or Boris Johnson, which seems, surreal, really.
Yeah. Well, you're very good at describing Applebaum's conceptual unreliability, as I would think of it. So she doesn't really understand authoritarianism, and she doesn't even understand liberalism, as you just mentioned, right? We've discussed in other episodes the horrible conflation of classical liberalism with liberal progressivism, as you phrase it in your book. And Applebaum seems to be making the same conflation that classical liberalism is progressive liberalism, and clearly it's not, because classical liberalism, to remind everybody, is about individual freedom, and progressivism is actually much more centrally directed. So at best it's making people free, but actually it's quite authoritarian in how it does that. So, and then we get onto the authoritarianism. So she accuses only conservatives or new conservatives, principally Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, the Polish regime, current regime, the Hungarian regime. Hungary is where John O'Sullivan is based, just to tie that together. And she's conflating concepts, and I think it's reductionist. So this is not a word that you use in your article, but she's reductionist. So she's got very few concepts to play with. It's democracy, authoritarianism, or liberalism, and it's within that triangle. She's playing around loosely with the concepts too. So it's very journalistic. I think her writing tends to be very journalistic. She is a journalist primarily, right? But she has academic. She has an academic home now, but she's primarily a journalist. So let's talk about these conflations. I want to jump the students onto page 65. So there's a key phrase, key statement by you on the second paragraph of 65. You say the reasons for this loss of faith in democracy, however, reveal a crisis not so much in established democracies themselves, but in the limited political vocabulary that social scientists employ to compare systems of government and to promote a particular progressive view of how they might function. So now we're bringing progressivism, the politics of progressivism, into this mistaken view of democracies. So can you explain how progressives get democracy wrong?
Well, I think if we look at democratic theory as it evolves in the 90s, as opposed to how it was understood in its initial comparative political science formulation, as that emerged in the Cold War, when comparative political science took off as a discipline, particularly in the United States, with the classic thinkers in the discipline, like Dahl, like Seymour Martin Lipset, and like Almond and Verber and Lucian Pye. They followed what they, and Huntington, of course, who's also central in this, kind of Cold War development of the comparative political science literature. Democracy is quantifiable. It follows a Schumpeterian model of capitalism, socialism, and democracy. And Schumpeter, who was, a cynical European at the end of, during the Second World War, noticing the evolution of capitalism, socialism, liberalism, the various ideologies, and said, well, simply, without imposing values, democracy is a system to make an economy grow. And it's simply this, that you have contestation, political contestation within a territorial unit of rule. You accept that there is a government and an opposition, and you have a mechanism for changing from government to opposition through an electoral process that is relatively open and relatively free. But basically, it's a clearly quantifiable mechanism. You have a regular elections, you have two parties, you have contestation, and you have a result, and it's not a winner-takes-all system, that the opposition and the government accept the terms of the electoral game. And for Schumpeter, well, if that model works and it creates the conditions for a market capital economy better than an authoritarian, bureaucratic, or an administrative state like Singapore becomes, then that's probably the best system. But he's got no, there's no value to democratization here. It's just a quantifiable arrangement that suits a modern capitalist economy. What happens in the 90s is that democratic theory wants to extend beyond this simple contestation model and add in other values like a sort of openness to minorities, social justice, openness to a range of what are progressive values that have nothing to do with the actual quantifiable process of elections, which can be measured and can be quantified, and you can make comparative judgments. When you're throwing in values, qualitative terms, and adding them to a quantifiable process, you're in a logically incoherent position, which is where democratic theory has ended up, not democracy itself, which actually seems to work as well, maybe not perfectly, and no system is perfect in a human condition. But the idea that if you're not on side with this concept stretching of democracy in a progressive direction, you're not democratic, is itself undemocratic or illiberal, which is exactly what they are accusing their opponents of being.
Yeah, so, well, you finished that answer perfectly for a segue to hypocrisy. So it seems to me that Anne Applebaum and her ilk are guilty of hypocrisy in this particular book. And that goes back to the conceptual unreliability of Anne Applebaum in this book and progressives on democracy. So in your answer, you're talking a lot about our structural conceptualization of democracy. So who has power? How do you elect that power, authorize that power? What are the checks and balances? Who has freedoms? Where is the fairness and the freedoms when we think about free and fair elections? So those are structural things, and then the virtue signaling that then gets added on, so it gets bolted on as for various reasons we haven't discussed yet. Those are sort of they're ideational, so they're not really structural. So we can have free and fair elections, but that's not acceptable unless we have economic equity also, right? So that's an ideational objective applied to material economics. So the hypocrisy here, it seems to me that then Applebaum is accusing conservatives of failing on some of the desirable attributes of democracy, which progressives themselves are failing at. So if we look at the top of page 65 for Schumpeter, Dahl is specifying structural attributes of democracy, such as free, fair, frequent elections, freedom of expression, alternative sources of information, such as media, and associational autonomy. All of those have been attacked by progressives in the 2010s. So social media censor our alternative sources of information. If you associate, we don't have associational autonomy, because if you associate with the wrong sort of people, you get cancelled. We don't have freedom of expression. If you disagree, if you're skeptical of the progressive consensus, you get cancelled. We don't even have free, fair elections, because the news media won't report on one of the presidential contenders' scandals. They'll only report on the other. So it's progressives who are damaging the structural components of democracy. At the same time, they're saying it's only conservatives who are doing this. So there is this conceptual, what do we call it? Conceptual looseness. I think it's more than convenient. I think it's a deliberate looseness. It's a conceptual slipperiness, which is convenient for progressives to say, this is a liberal and we are liberal. So your form of, your classical liberalism is not actually liberal. You're too autonomous and you're voting for the wrong people. So there's this slipperiness of concepts. And then there's the hypocrisy of calling out only one side for what both sides, at least both sides, but primarily progressives, are predominant at in this electoral cycle, which is censorship and cancelling people and filtering and all the rest of it. So I suppose that's a long way of getting to the question. So why has our field, so we're both political scientists, why has our field become politicized like this and so limited in their vocabulary, as you put it, and also our conceptual nuance, as I would put it?
Well, I think the one of the problems that you know is you know, I suppose central is all our vocabulary anyway was somewhat ambivalent. You know, I mean, we have the language of politics, as you know, whether it's Arendt or Michael Oakeshott would have argued that concepts like democracy, like freedom, like justice are historical compounds. You know, they mutate to some extent over time. But you know, as a political scientist, you should be deeply aware or cognizant of the ambivalence and be very clear about how you're using a term. You know, I mean, there's a common, you know, kind of popular view of democracy, of justice, of freedom. But as a political scientist or a political theorist, you should be trying to use them with some greater clarity than just a common usage. Not that the common usage does not feed into your understanding too. But what seems to have happened is not only a conflation of terms, but a tendency to place, for instance, an understanding that's classically liberal of liberty, which is about individualism and individuality, which is an understanding, a mode of being that emerges in the European understanding from the 16th and 17th century onwards, without the invention of the individual around the Renaissance. We wouldn't have had the concept of an individual capacity to self-create and explore that character, which is the basis of our understandings of things like privacy and property. And you know, that sort of liberal individuality, which created the conditions for not only representative understandings of democracy, of valuing each individual as one and only one, but also the conditions for a private space that sees a distinction between that and the public realm. And that was central to our evolution of a representative democratic understanding, and classically captured by, of course, the American founding fathers like Hamilton and Madison in the Federalist Papers, who thought very deeply about that condition that they were you know, trying to establish of a governance system that created relatively weak government to allow the individual to flourish. Hence, you know, they followed not only classical sources, but also they read their Locke, but particularly their Montesquieu. And they knew that you required power to balance power, so that you needed a separation of powers, and you wanted exactly a situation where a president couldn't override the Senate or the Supreme Court. in other words, they recognized, and classical liberals recognized, that sort of practice, that political practice that allowed for liberty was something to be treasured, as Arendt puts it in her great, kind of interrogation of American revolutionary tradition in On Revolution. Against that tradition, also in modernity, there was a tradition that rejected individuality and created, particularly from the 19th century onwards, which appealed to a sort of ressentiment of the individual, and replaced it with an anti-individuality, the idea that actually some people can't cope with individuality. They have to be looked after, they have to be nurtured, and they have to be managed. And instead of the state being an umpire, allowing the free movement of creative individuals, that the state now had to become a manager of not individuals, but anti-individuals who become mass men in a collective. And what we've seen, in recent democratic discourse is the use of the language of a politics of individuality, of liberty, and its corruption by this collectivist mentality that says, now, instead of democracy being free individuals joining together in political parties to advance their interests, they now have to be collectives that eschew anything that's non-progressive. And democracy and progressivism then become a collectivist understanding, which is antithetical to its constitutional origins, whether in English constitutional thought from Hobbes and Locke, or American constitutional thought since the Declaration of Independence, really.
Right. So on page 66, you effectively reset our understanding of democracy to what you call constitutional government. So this is the government you just described as one that is more than of an umpire rather than a director. So you mentioned Hannah Arendt there. So I want to get to that. So your discussion in this article is going to start on page 67. And I think that's a reading that is going to be least familiar to students of political science, because, well, I read Hannah Arendt in graduate school, but I don't think many people assign Arendt anymore. And as you note, Anne Applebaum gives a she communicates a false version of Arendt. And I think the Montesquieu, the Dahl, the Schumpeter will be more familiar, although I think Schumpeter is another one who's not being assigned much anymore as a reading. It used to be, you correct me if I'm wrong, it used to be routine. I don't think it's routine anymore. So let's talk about Arendt, because you're one of the few people who really know Arendt's writing. Now, what does Applebaum get wrong about Arendt?
Well, I mean, the thing about Arendt is she is still, I think, more recognized than some other political theorists that were very commonly part of the political science undergraduate and postgraduate, sort of introductions to political thought or introductions to constitutional government. So what's significant? Well, Arendt's work, her most famous work, which Applebaum misquotes, is The Origins of Totalitarianism. And Arendt is herself part of a diaspora of German, usually Jewish intellectuals who fled the Third Reich and ended up in America. and appreciated very much the terms of political and constitutional freedom that America offered when they arrived there from the Third Reich, either in the late 30s or from the 40s onwards. So that there was a group of diasporic German thinkers like Arendt, but also like Leo Strauss and Eric Voegelin and Carl Friedrich, who all thought about the conditions of, what had happened to Europe, the totalitarian disaster that had devastated it, but also what led up to that from the First World War, that had a catastrophic impact on their understandings of, the 19th century understandings of progress, evolving state power, and constitutional arrangements that would, be better than anywhere else historically, that modernity had been a tremendous achievement. The Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, the Democratic Revolutions, the idea of progress had all been shattered for these people. Firstly, by the experience of the First World War, then the experience of Weimar, and then the catastrophe of Nazism, which, in Arendt's case, could have led to her being in a concentration camp. And also the fact that her PhD supervisor and sometimes lover, Martin Heidegger, had become, the defender of the party. So all these are coming together in Arendt's, one of her major works, which is The Origins of Totalitarianism, and trying to understand not just the way in which the Jewish population of Central Europe were deemed, worthy of obliteration, but how an understanding could work that would see a relative, an advanced polity of educated people go along with that genocidal fascist movement and have some intellectual credibility for it, with people like Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, and others, giving justification for this brutal arrangement. And she notes what Arendt notes about it, what she wants to contrast is the value of a democratic political arrangement, which is based on persuasion, to a totalitarian movement that is a form of tyranny. And a very remarkable new form of tyranny because of the power of the mass media, the power of the industrial military complex that a tyrannical regime can now bring to its capacity, or its capacity to organize itself and the people in terms of a single ideological movement governed by a leadership principle, the Führerprinzip, and how that is plausible for a population to be mobilized towards for this, an elite party to mobilize the masses in a collective direction towards the extermination of one group, the Jewish population, but also then to expand to dominate what it sees as the servile Slavic world in an activist movement that values violence and power as the means to inscribe itself. And it relies upon not and this is the crucial point, it's not authoritarian, it's totalitarian and dictatorial. It despises authority because it wants the masses fragmented so it can be totally controlled. It wants the masses fragmented, disconnected, and only held together by the Führer Prinzip. In other words, it abhors hierarchy. It just requires the party and the mass and their unification in a kind of hysterical unity by the denunciation of the outgroup other, in what Orwell would describe as, kind of hate sessions. So that understanding of the totalitarian order is very different from what she would see as an order based on authority. You could have authoritarianism of a kind of structured character, which had hierarchies, elites, but mediated classes within it, in which different groups had roles. That could be authoritarian, it could be patriarchal, but it wasn't totalitarian. And what Applebaum does is actually to say that Arendt defends the idea of what she calls the authoritarian personality, which is, in the way Applebaum uses it, a precursor to, is really a totalitarian personality. And actually, Arendt never uses the term authoritarian personality. She discounts it. It's used by Marxists like Adorno and Horkheimer, and she refers to them, whom she's got very little time for, the Frankfurt School, as the proponents of the so-called authoritarian personality. She's not interested in the authoritarian person, she's interested in the mechanisms of totalitarianism. And this sort of casuistic manipulation of Arendt to say that her authoritarian personality is a precursor for a Hitlerian figure is exactly contrary to what she argues in the last part of the Origins. So the importance of Arendt is that she is acutely aware of the terms of political vocabulary and how we have to be very careful about how we understand and how we treat concepts like authority, like tradition, like liberty, and like equality. And we've lost that in this sort of hysterical move towards a progressive utopia, which the end of history kind of facilitated, but has had this hubristic reaction that we're seeing at the moment. And we need to probably get back to writers like Arendt. The other one, in English schools, from about the 60s through to the 80s, the elementary primer for undergraduates was Bernard Crick's In Defense of Politics, who was, a student of Carl Friedrich, I think, or he'd spent graduate school time with Carl Friedrich. It's about the idea of a political realm as opposed to a totalitarian or authoritarian one. So a number of writers, whether they were on the center left or the center right, would agree that politics is about creating a space we call the state, in which persuasion prevails between different groups, that we are persuaded to follow a certain course. We might change our mind a few years later. We might go from being more, liberal, conservative, towards more social democratic, depending on circumstances and arguments that prevail. But politics is the space of persuasion, and it's having that public space and a private realm that enables the practice of freedom, which is not an abstraction, it's an actual practice and an activity. And a range of writers, particularly writers like Crick or Voegelin or Arendt or Oakeshott or Leo Strauss were deeply aware of that. And we used to read them, not just at graduate school, but at undergraduate level. And the loss of that with this sort of promotion of something called democratization theory and its kind of darker twin critical theory has undermined all our previous awareness of what political thought and the history of political thought should entail, really.
Yeah, that's a good point you made just at the end there. The democratic theory is not even a theory. It's really a prejudice in literal terms. It is a prejudice. It's not a theory. It doesn't explain anything. It asserts something, and that is the wider problem with critical theory. Yes. So very well said, David. We I think have contributed here to the call for a return to conceptual clarity, conceptual reliability, and honesty about the full discourse, which involves going back to some of the political scientists that are no longer read, or if they are read, they're not represented correctly, like Hannah Arendt. So thank you, David. You have added enormously to our understanding of a short article which captures so much about the decline of democracy and the decline of discourse about politics itself. So David, I thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
For our next discussion.
Thank you. Thanks.